Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on prenuptial agreements. So this video was going to be a lot longer and a lot more complicated, but most of the complicated parts I already took care of in contract unconscionability and adhesion contracts. So if you haven't seen those, please watch those, otherwise this video might not make much sense to you. And really it only leaves, two things for me to talk about. One of them is what is a prenuptial agreement, and the other one is when are they unenforceable. So a prenuptial agreement, okay, let me take a step back. When you marry somebody, you are basically joining your assets and debts together. And certain states don't do this, at least not, all states are different, so please check into the details before you just go by what I said. But in Nevada, which is a community asset or community property state, you join in assets and debts. And so when you divorce, then the court has to split them up. So there's all of these statutes and case law on how assets and debts are split up when you get divorced. And for the most part, it's a 50-50 even split on anything that any property that you came upon or any debts that you came upon while you guys were married. The prenuptial agreement basically allows you to agree before you get married that we're not going to follow the general guidelines, the general law, and we're going to do something different for us specifically. So that basically covers what a prenuptial agreement is. Some people enter into postnuptial agreements. I'm not sure how those work at all. It's basically an agreement after you've been married as to how you're going to split things up. I'm not sure what they are, if they're enforceable or how they work, but I do know that they exist. So the second part of the video is going to basically cover when prenuptial agreements are enforceable. So as I mentioned in my previous video, contract unconscionability is one of the things that you have to look into, and it's actually in subsection B. I'm going to go ahead and post the statute in the description below so you can take a look at what it looks like in Nevada. In Nevada, it's NRS 123A.080, and it has subsections 1, 2, and 3. And within subsection 1, it talks about when the agreement is unenforceable. So just like that, you can read in plain English, well, in legalese, you can read when an agreement that you enter into with your spouse, a prenuptial agreement, you enter into it, you sign it, you read it, everything's great, or so it seems. You read subsection 1 and you can find out if any of those, if any of that language isn't satisfied, that prenuptial agreement is void. Despite the fact that they agreed it, despite the fact that everything seemed above board and fair, it doesn't matter, too bad. So most of the language is boilerplate. What I did find curious was subsection C, because it actually is a little bit detailed on a very specific requirement that your opponent has to know the property that you had and also the financial obligations that you had going into the marriage. And if they don't know those things, or could not have possibly known when they signed the prenuptial agreement, then the prenuptial agreement is void, just like that. So that's a curious thing that I read. Definitely something to look into when it comes to your state. I also noticed another little detail in there that said that you can't basically go to court and say, well, my wife or my husband said they didn't actually want to look into my stuff. They didn't want to look into my obligations, my financial obligations. They didn't want to look into my property. They just trusted me and wanted to sign the piece of paper. You actually can't do that, because in that same statute it says if they want to waive the right to look into your finances, they have to do so in writing. So you can't even go to court and really do the word versus word. I'm just going to accuse you of not caring and not wanting to look into my stuff and get away with this. It's not going to work, because if you don't have some kind of piece of paper that says that they voluntarily waived their right to look into your finances, there goes the prenuptial agreement. So anyway, most of the details, as I mentioned, most of the alarming things are covered in the previous videos, contract unconscionability and adhesion contracts. Take a look at those. But yeah, this is basically just something I wanted to caution people with. Just like I talked about in my previous video, child support waivers, it's just another example in the whole family law area of a piece of paper or an agreement that you can make even in court in front of a judge that the judge approves. That can then be challenged later. Just like that. And if the judge doesn't like it and doesn't want to follow the law on any of these things, well, they can appeal, just like those cases I talked about in my previous videos. they can appeal it, and the Supreme Court will force your judge to, they'll reverse the decision and force your judge to throw out that contract, throw out that prenuptial agreement. And in not so many words, you end up screwed. So hopefully this is just an example for people to look at. If they're thinking about prenuptial agreements, look into your state, read the requirements, and follow them carefully. And even if they're followed, remember, sometimes this stuff comes down to testimony and evidence. Even if they're followed, sometimes your opponent will lie. And then in court, if you can't prove that the statutes were followed, and the judge believes them, the agreement's tossed. It's just thrown out. So anyway, I hope this video is actually useful to people. I'm not sure if it will be. I know for me, I didn't get married to my ex, so I didn't have to really deal with division of assets or debts. I didn't have to deal with prenuptial agreements or anything like that. One thing I'm curious about is entering any kind of child custody stuff into a prenuptial agreement. I highly doubt that those things would be enforceable because children aren't property. So I just kind of wanted to mention that if you put something in your prenuptial agreement about like who's going to have custody and all these other curious details, I'm sure that the court's going to say, well, it's great that you guys made this agreement, but we're going to actually follow the law as to how child custody is going to go. I don't imagine that you can just treat your kids kind of like pets and just say, you know, they're getting the 2 cats, I'm getting the dog. It doesn't work that way. They're going to look into all of the child custody statutes and best interest of the child and all that. So I don't know, there might be something in your state that says that the court has to follow an agreement absent, I don't know, child abuse or neglect or something. I don't know. Something else to look into is whether or not you can actually put child custody details into a prenuptial agreement. I'm not sure that you can, and if you can, it's probably a very limited thing. But anyway, with that, I'm going to end this video.